Hello, everyone. Welcome,
Hello, hello.
welcome to the sixth annual Indiana University Taras Shevchenko Conference. It's such a pleasure to be hosting this conference this year with my colleague, Dr. Svetlana Melnik. We want to thank the members of all of the cohorts of the Non-Residential Scholars Program for Ukraine who have been involved in organizing this conference. We're really looking forward to highlighting the work of our colleagues. I want to say a few words of thanks. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm a professor of anthropology at Indiana University and a scholar of Ukraine. I'll remind folks or inform you that we do have interpretation available for this conference. It's entirely bilingual. So to take advantage of the interpretation, you can simply go to the globe on your Zoom toolbar and click on it and select either English or Ukrainian. And of course, we want to thank our wonderful interpreters, Yana Husak and Anastasia Bublik. Thank you so much for the work that you continue to do for this program. Our conference this year has several wonderful sponsors. Those include the Indiana University Ukrainian Studies Organization, the Robert F. Prince Russian and East European Institute, the Department of Slavic Languages, Literatures, and Cultures here at Indiana University, as well as the Big Ten Academic Alliance. So that's it for my very brief introductory remarks, and I will turn the virtual microphone over to Svetlana Melnik.
Дуже дякую, пані Саро.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Sarah is the organizer of this conference. She's the one who initiated the program, and I am sincerely grateful for everything that she has been doing for it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure that we can keep in touch with you, that we can work together with you in the framework of this conference. This collaboration inspires us, and I'd like to emphasize that our conference serves as an amazing platform for scholarly communication, and this is a platform that helps us to withstand these challenging times. I would like to say a few words about the background of our conference, Taras Shevchenko Ukrainian Studies Conference. It started in 2020 by two of our postgraduate students who initiated starting this conference, Natalia Shpileva-Said and Ani Abrahamian. These are our postgraduate students who form the part of the student organization of Ukrainian Studies. Now they already work, they found jobs, and starting 2023, this scholarly forum serves as the platform for sharing opinions, scientific interests, specifically for non-residential participants. And among the plenary participants were such renowned scholars and personalities: Mykola Rabchuk, Vitaly Trinetsky, Oksana Zabushko, Tamara Hundorova, Serhiy Plokhy, and others, just to name a few. And one more thing that I would like to note. We are planning to also make an online publication of the materials in the framework of this conference, and we're working with Asmati Chabalashvili and with the National Academy of Arts so that we can implement this idea and turn it into life. Once again, a huge thank you for all the inspiration, all the work, and I would like to wish all of us successful and amazing conference, because everything that we're talking about is extremely relevant. And now I'd like to pass the virtual microphone to Nadia Hanshrenko, who will be moderating the first panel. Over to you.
Доброго дня, дякую дуже за
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for giving me the floor, and thank you for having invited me. Thank you for this opportunity to work with you. We have been doing it for 6 years now, ever since this conference was initiated. I'm happy to form a part of this forum for 6 years in a row, and I'd like to thank the organizers for that. So the first panel that is gonna kick off this conference is called Identity, Memory, and Transformation in Ukrainian Literary Discourse from Shevchenko to the Modern World. And first, we would like to give the floor to Ms. Halina Alexandrova. She is a doctor of philology, professor of the Department of History of Ukrainian Literature, and she works at the National Library of Ukrainian after Vernadsky. So she will talk about Shevchenko in the epistolary discourse of Mykola Storozhenko. I will be sharing her presentation, so please give me a second to share my screen. I hope that you can see the slides.
Так,
Can you?
бачимо.
Yes, we can. Amazing. Thank you so much. So, Halina, the floor is yours. And I would like to ask each speaker to stick to the time frame. Please don't forget others also have to speak. 15 minutes is the time that you have. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present Shevchenko in the epistolary discourse of Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko. Oftentimes, I'm going to mention his patronymic because my presentation covers two family members who have the same name and the same last name. So the issue of returning to Ukraine the names of individuals who lived abroad but remain deeply connected to their native land still deserves particular attention. Today, we're rethinking our understanding of our own history and the individuals who contributed to the creation of Ukrainian culture even outside of it. Among the significant sources thereof are the epistolary works of scholars and biographers of Shevchenko. Correspondence played a crucial role in their efforts, as it allowed them to not only investigate the poet's life, but also learn about his surroundings, which helped in understanding him both as a person and as an artist. The letters of Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko are of particular importance, who lived from 1836 until 1906. So basically, he even lived in the same time frame of Shevchenko for a few years. And many of those letters are still not getting enough attention from the scholars. Storozhenko, a descendant of a Cossack and later a noble family, which traces its roots back to the early 17th century. After graduating from the first Kiev gymnasium, Storozhenko followed the advice of his father's friend, Osip Bodansky. And next slide, please, now. Osip Bodansky back then already was a professor at Moscow University. So, Mykola Storozhenko enrolled in the History and Philology department at the aforementioned institution. Later, gained recognition as a prominent Shakespearean scholar and head of the Department of Foreign Literature at Moscow University. His contribution to Shevchenko studies are also well known. He authored 11 articles on Shevchenko and several notes published in journals and collections during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, his interest in Shevchenko's work and biography was primarily caused by Osip Bodansky, whom I mentioned earlier on, who knew the poet really well. Storozhenko corresponded with numerous recipients about his search for unknown aspects of Shevchenko's life, mainly in the archives of the 3rd Department of the Police Department in St. Petersburg. Storozhenko gained access to these archives thanks to his connection and persistence. His correspondence included Ukrainian figures such as Alexander Lashkevich and Volodymyr Naumenko, the editors-in-chief of the magazine Kievskaya Starina, as well as renowned scholars like Vladimir Antonovich and Pavlo Zhitetsky. He also wrote to Alexander Kanitsky, Fyodor Lazarevsky, Alina Kostomarova, the wife of Mykola Kostomarov, about his search for documents related to Shevchenko. One notable excerpt from a letter by Mykola Storozhenko to Alexander Kanitsky a writer and biographer of Shevchenko, reads. So, Storozhenko wrote, "Excuse me for not having written to you for a long time and for writing in a way that is not ours, because in 30 years I have not only forgotten how to write, but also how to speak Ukrainian. I only restore my knowledge when I live in Little Russia for 2 or 3 months during the summer." All his letters are written in Russian, though some contain Ukrainian phrases, and we have quoted them in Ukrainian. Several of these letters mention Storozhenko's intention to write a biography of Shevchenko, though unfortunately this plan was never realized. Most of the letters are addressed to his second nephew, a student at St. Volodymyr's University in the 1880s, and a well-known historian and teacher later, Mykola Volodymyrovich Storozhenko. You can see him on this slide. In this presentation, I focus primarily on these letters, which are preserved in the Central State Historical Archive of Ukraine. The Shevchenko theme in Storozhenko's letters to his nephew revolves largely around his publication in Kievskaya Starina. And on the next slide, you can see this magazine. It was established in 1882 and invited prominent scholars to contribute. Among them was also professor of Moscow University, Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko, who answered to the call of his fellow countrymen to collaborate. On January 25, 1883, he writes his first letter to his nephew. In this letter, Mykola Ilyich asks Mykola Volodymyrovich to act as an intermediary between him and the editorial board of Kievskaya Starina. He explained that he was unable to complete the promised article on time due to his heavy workload. That is why he requested that his nephew inform the editorial board that his article, new materials for the biography of Shevchenko, which he had committed to, would be ready for publication in the March issue. However, I do not insist on this, he wrote. I mention it only in case the editorial board has nothing on Shevchenko for the February issue. If there is something, then any statement would be unnecessary. I will finish my article by shrovetide and send it to Kiev immediately. It is important to note that the Kiev censor did not approve some of Storozhenko's footnotes in the article. The work was sent for review to the St. Petersburg Main Directorate for Press Affairs, and it was published almost 5 years later under a different title, The First 4 Years of Shevchenko's Exile. In a letter dated January 2, 1886, Mykola Ilyich congratulated his nephew on being retained at St. Volodymyr's University, expressing hope for shared scientific interests. I sincerely congratulate you on the honor that the department has shown to you. The fact that you're being retained at the university will give you a solid foundation, and I hope will bring you into our camp, he wrote. One of the most detailed letters to Mykola Volodymyrovich is dated December 14, 1887. In it, Mykola Ilyich discusses his presentation titled Chepkin and Shevchenko, delivered on the occasion of the anniversary of the famous actor. Professor Storozhenko shares the news about a unique gift he received. Among the attendees of his presentation was a man named Smirnov, whom we have been unable to identify, the owner of an 1860 edition of Shevchenko's Kobzar, and Smirnov gave this edition to Storozhenko. This particular copy had originally belonged to Shevchenko's friend Ivan Lazarevsky, who had received it as a gift from Shevchenko himself in St. Petersburg, along with a personal inscription. All the censored poems in the book were later added by someone else's hand. Storozhenko speculated that it was Ivan Lazarevsky who wrote down the poems dictated by Shevchenko. And it is true. Subsequent research confirmed that Lazarevsky, not Shevchenko, was the one who added the poems to Kobzar, as he had assisted Shevchenko with copying his works. Storozhenko submitted his speech on Chepkin and Shevchenko for publication in Gatsuk's newspaper, a publication in Moscow run by Ukrainian Alexei Hatsuk. Following its publication, the professor expressed regret in a letter to his nephew, stating that the article should have been sent to Kyivskaya Starina instead, where it would have a more appropriate outlet. Notably, the article was reprinted 2 more times, including an abridged Ukrainian translation published in the Lviv magazine titled Zarya. Particularly important for understanding Storozhenko Sr.'s pro-Ukrainian views and national identity is a letter dated January 25, 1887, in which he gratefully accepts the offer to continue collaborating with Kyivskaya Starina. He writes that he is ready to do everything possible for the literature and antiquities of the people, the blood connection with which I have recently felt quite vividly. However, the same problem remained. There was not enough time to accomplish everything he wished to. The letter reveals the intense workload of the scholar. During the 12 festive days of Christmas, from Christmas to Epiphany, he promised to write 3 articles. As a result, he worked on the article about Shevchenko in fragments between lectures and compiling an index to the works of the American historian and literary scholar Victor Tickner. On May 22, 1888, Storozhenko's letter first mentions his meeting with Princess Varvara Repnina, a friend of Shevchenko's, who had been living in Moscow in recent years. She informed Mykola Ilyich that a stash of Shevchenko's letter to her, written in 1843-1844, had been left in Yahutin. And the professor asked his nephew, who lived in the vicinity of Yahutin, to search for them. Such letters would be a precious find, Mykola Ilyich emphasized. Princess Varvara Repnina appears in Storozhensko's letters in 1891 in relation to her obituary. The professor wrote a brief farewell piece about the princess for the newspaper Russkie Vedomosti and informed his nephew that he was waiting for Repnina's niece, Olga Pavlovna Orlova, and her granddaughter to return from the village. Without them, he explained, it would be impossible to write a detailed obituary. Therefore, he asked the editorial staff of Kyivskaya Starina to wait. Storozhenko hoped he would be able to gather additional biographical information from the Orlovs and review Varvara Repnina's unfinished notes, which she had begun to write for her granddaughter. The magazine Kyivskaya Starina did reprint the short obituary written by Storozhenko, but unfortunately, he never completed the promised more detailed version. Storozhenko's letters are also filled with concern for the fate of Kyivskaya Starina. After learning of the death of the editor-in-chief Alexander Lashkevich in 1889, Mykola Ilyich expressed concern that the magazine might cease publication. Therefore, he proposed creating a sharehold-based company to ensure its survival. Storozhenko believed that if he were living in Kiev, he would publish at his own risk to help a good cause and attach his good name to it. There would be no great risk, and besides, there is always an opportunity to make the magazine more interesting and therefore more profitable, he wrote. After graduating from St. Volodymyr's University, Mykola Volodymyrovich Storozhenko also began publishing his research on the history of Ukraine in the magazine Kyivskaya Starina. Often, the magazine published their materials without their second initials, leading to misunderstandings about the authorship. Mykola Ilyich humorously remarked about this in a letter. You see how advantageous it is to have one literal name. You can be attributed mine and vice versa. So we will be doubly glorified, he wrote ironically on October 7, 1891. The professor frequently wrote to his nephew about his trips to St. Petersburg, but he noted that each time he had very little time to study the archives. For example, he said, I was in St. Petersburg for less than a week. I will go again for the holidays. in 1891. In a letter to his nephew dated January 25, 1893, Strozenko reported on his scientific research and recent findings. I recently returned from St. Petersburg with new materials for Shevchenko's biography, which I found in the case of the artist Shevchenko kept in the archive. I discovered much more than I expected. The unpublished long poem Aspen, several unknown small poems, many letters from Shevchenko's friends, and an interesting letter from Shevchenko to Dubelt. It is important to note that the Lieutenant General was investigating the case of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood. Strozenko was unable to transcribe everything as he was in St. Petersburg for 3 days only. The professor outlined his plans based on the materials he found. He intended to write a short article for the February issue of Kievskaya Starina. And on February 27, 1899, Strozenko's letter mentions Vasil Horlenko. Next slide, please. A fellow Ukrainian of Kazakh descent who worked primarily in St. Petersburg as a writer, journalist, and publicist. If you see Horlenko, Strozenko Sr. wrote to Strozenko Jr., tell him that when he passes through Moscow, he should come visit me, and I will take him to a painting enthusiast who owns 10 completely unknown drawings by Shevchenko, sepia, purchased from the secretary of the Academy of Art Somov.
Дуже перепрошую, я прошу вас.
Halina, I'm very sorry, but I would like to ask you to wind up. Sadly, Professor Strozenko, due to the health issues, could not work probably, and his last publication was dedicated to the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood and about Mykola Hulaka. Sadly, after he passed away, and it was published in Kievskaya Starina, together with the obituary. And in the obituary, the editorial office described him as one of the greatest representatives of the defense of our Ukrainian cultural and social tasks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Дякуємо пані Галині.
Thank you so much, Halina.
Припиню ділитися екраном. І я дуже прошу до слова нашу наступну доповідачку.
Thank you very much, Halina. And now I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, Oksana Pokhonska. She holds a PhD in philology, and she is the representative of National Astronomy Academy. Oksana Pokhonska will tell us about literature as a text of war, memory, experience, trauma. Oksana, over to you. Good afternoon once again, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to be part of this conference. I am very glad to be among such prominent scholars. Let me try and share my screen. Can you see it on the screen? Yes, we can see your presentation. Well, we see your slides, but unfortunately they are not full screen. All right, let me try and adjust my presentation. Well, unfortunately, I will not be able to see you, but at least you can see the slides. And please do not hesitate to interrupt me if I take too much time. And now let me present my input. My presentation is called Literature as a Text of War, Memory, Experience, Trauma. Over the past half-century, despite persistent efforts to historicize war as a phenomenon, it has remained ever present on the radars of our memory, both in personal family stories and in the collective national consciousness. The memory of war also permeates everyday informational and political discourses. Particularly, this became evident after the Second World War. The life is the biggest value, and we need to learn our lessons. Unfortunately, the local wars that have erupted worldwide since 1945 suggest that the globe opted for further fighting for global dominance, and no lessons were learned from the World War II, from the Second World War. The literature tries to interpret the war in a specific ways, particularly in the case of Ukraine. Starting years 2000, we see that there is a lot of interest in the national attempt to think about the Second World War, to reflect on the lessons learned. And this will all result in a completely different discourse that is yet to appear in 2015, slightly later. We can exemplify this trend by Yakov's Century or Oksana Zabushka's works. And we see that there is a reflection of these local wars in historical texts, as sometimes we see the narratives about the war of the others. In this case, we could recall the example of Vasil Slavchuk, who is telling us about the war in Afghanistan, and he is trying to tell us about the characters who found themselves in these difficult circumstances. Another interesting example is the case of the wars that took place after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, these topics pertain to the domain of the war of the others, which became a characteristic feature of Ukrainian war texts, literature about war. For instance, Sergei Pantyuk and his work about the war brings up the topic of the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And we also see that it is particularly important in the wake of the situation in Transnistria, as we are following the story of a combatant who is an active participant of the hostilities. And on the other hand, we may learn about the narratives that are offered by Russia and that are promoted by Russia. This is crucial regarding the information warfare, and these trends are very important from the point of view of what was happening since 2014. After 2014, we see that Ukrainian humanities have already developed a certain methodology for studying military texts, and it becomes shaped in words, but yet framed in historic and literary context. First and foremost, we are talking about the memory of the past. The memory of the past, that is the memory of the family, the generational memory, the historic memory. With this, these texts are trying to show the current trends and the current experiences of this war. On the other hand, we see an attempt to withstand the decolonization efforts of the Russians and their ambitions. And we see that this contemporary war literature also shows us both the modern war as a collective and societal trauma, and the mental health of a Ukrainian nation depends on the processing of this trauma. This is individual and collective experience of current trauma, and we see that loss becomes, and the feeling of being lost becomes an attribute, inalienable attribute of war texts. And we mean that in this case, this is not just literature about a war. These texts become war literature. There are historic reasons to that. since we have this personal experience. And on the other hand, we are also talking about the texts that offer us accounts of the events that are taking place here and now, the events that are taking place in the lives of Ukrainians living under the circumstances of this war. It is worth mentioning that literary text of war broadened its role in the history and in the global scope, as now it is not simply an artistic work. And we see that it gained functionality, additional functions. If we were to speak about the memory, memory is the foundation of the word discourse. And in this particular case, we need to speak about the memory being utilized in the context of finding the right wording for the interpretation of this current war. It is also important not to forget the historic aspects of shaping Ukrainian identity, the previous wars and the current war. And in this regard, we are rather limited in terms of its literary interpretation. We have very limited amount of literary works. And on the other hand, we see that there are accounts of the liberation struggles of Ukrainians, and these descriptions, these accounts give us an opportunity to have a glimpse at what was happening there, and this information is also brought to the present. It allows us to reflect on that. Another glimpse at the war literature is offered by the family stories. We see that there is particular modification in the stories, as we see that there is some disruption in terms of generational memory. We see that one generation might cherish their Ukrainian roots, and the next generation might be hostile to everything that is Ukrainian. The experience of the war is mostly focused on the concept of the personal stories of the liberation struggles and preservation of national identity. Memory is a voice of experience. Apart from that, we may pay attention to the opportunity to reconsider the historic events, the historic victories and losses, and how it is reflected in culture and in literary works. An issue of trauma is also an example I would like to offer to you. That pertains to colonization by Russia and by the Soviet Union, persecutions, particularly of the 1920s and 1930s, the issues of artificial famine, and the Ukrainian identity been destroyed at various stages of the liberation struggles and the war. Contemporary war literature encompasses these three functions, and we see that with time they changed. Literature remains to carry this aesthetic function, and yet these functions are amplified by modern interpretations. For instance, current literary texts are not artistic works anymore, and they have some features of functionality now, as they are offering us a glimpse into the individual and collective experience of trauma. It offers us some opportunities for fiction, and it gives space to fiction and conjecture. And on the other hand, it gives us an opportunity to reflect upon the events and phenomena. We see that mostly media are supposed to do this kind of work, but given that there is a certain potential bias among journalists, literary text assumes this function as it is rather unbiased, at least from this perspective. The highest priority for such a text is to comprehend the dimensions of the war and of those dimensions that are often generalized, simplified, or presented in the text as the ideological part. We believe that belletrist, that fiction, belletrist style, and poetry alongside chemical weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles and robotic drones. Oksana, I hope that you are wrapping up. Yes, well, that was a quote from Ron Capps. And I would like to say that text takes into consideration the experience of the past, but it also performs a therapeutic function at a different level. So literary text helps us to work with trauma in cases where specific institutions have no reach, or in such cases where an author or a reader requires proper reflection and pondering on their own trauma. Thus, modern Ukrainian literature about war literature, is focused on the stories of present day, and the war texts that were created before 2022 and after are completely different in terms of their narratives. As after the full-scale invasion, new narratives emerge. Those pertain to migration, internal migration, displacement, and also we see the texts that are dedicated to the life away from the front line. And at the same time, we see that the generational trauma are still evident. They remain as the key story and the key narrative, and they remain on the before our eyes, both in Ukraine but also globally. Particularly if we take into consideration the Soviet and imperial experience, which didn't have any accountability, we see that this trauma persists. Thank you very much, Oksana. I enjoyed your last sentence a lot. Thank you very much, Oksana. And now I would like to give the floor to our next speaker. I would like to give the floor to Natalia Marchenko. She holds PhD in philology, and she is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Historic Researches of the National Library, named after Vernadsky at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Natalia will tell us about Ukrainian books for children and youth 2014-2024, trauma, transformation, and identity. Natalia, please stick to the time frame.
I was wondering, how can I share my slides? How can I share my presentation? Can you see my screen now? Yes, yes.
Чудово, дякую.
Yeah, yeah,
Дякую.
amazing.
Я найперше хочу
Thank you so
подякувати за
much.
можливість
First and foremost, I would like to
озвучити
express the
свої
gratitude
роздуми.
for
Я
joining this
книгознавець, а не
conversation today.
філолог. І
And I'm not a
ми
philologist,
хочемо
but I'm a
могли
book
з
scholar.
собою
And
більше
the aim of
познайомити
my presentation
коло
is to give an
дослідників з
overview
дитячою
for
книжкою,
the
тому
peer
що, на жаль,
scholars
про неї вона надзвичайно
regarding the
запитувана, але, на жаль, про
children
неї
youth
дуже
literature,
мало і
because,
некладеними фактами.
there is such a huge demand, but people know so little about it.
Мови,
So the
культури,
adults are the
історичної
carriers of
пам'яті,
language,
ідентичності,
culture, historical
грамоти,
memory, identity,
а
trauma,
діти
and
лише
so on.
набувають
And
повністю чи
children, however,
частково
only
цей
acquire
чи інший
partially
досвід в
these
процесі розвитку.
experiences.
І коли ми говоримо про травму
When we
щодо
discuss
дитинства щодо
trauma
дітей,
or
то
identity in
потрібно
relation to
пам'ятати,
children,
що
we're
йдеться про
speaking
процес
about a process,
травматизації тут
the
і сьогодні.
experience of trauma here
Так
and
само
now.
ідентичність дорослого
And
виявляється в
identity
властиву
of an adult is
здатності
primarily
людини
defined by their
повторювати
ability
чи
to
продовжувати
maintain
певні
and
наративи,
continue
історію
certain
власного
narratives,
життя.
the story of
А
their own
дитина
self.
їх лише
A child,
набуває або
however, acquires
трансформує.
and transforms the
Тому
sense of
вимога
identity.
і увага
And
до
this is
прироблення
why the
дітей з
demands and
боку
attention
держави,
given to
рідних
children's books
спільнот
from the state and
завжди
various
була в рази
communities
більшою, ніж до
are
загальної
far greater
літератури.
than those
Бо
given to
саме
general
книжка для
literature.
дітей дає
It is
змогу
children's
змінювати
literature,
суспільну
and that
думку,
has the power
формувати
to shape
нову
public
ідентичність,
opinion, foster a new
уникаючи або
identity,
навпаки
and
запобігаючи
either avoid or
травматизації,
perpetuate the
котрої вже
traumas
зазнали попередні
experienced by
покоління.
previous generations.
Творцями книжок для
The
дітей
creators
є
of children's
промоутерами,
books,
покупцями
along with
і
their
критиками
promoters,
є
buyers, and
здебільшого
critics,
дорослі.
are mostly
Їхні
adults.
травми і
Their
їхня
traumas and
ідентичність
sense
завжди
of
тієї чи
identity
іншої мірою
inevitably
відбивається на книжці для
influence
дітей
both
і
the
на
children's
процесі
book
її
itself
читання.
and the process
І
of
оця
reading it.
двоадресність
This
розвитку книжок для
duality
дітей
makes children's
є
literature one of the
забезпеченням м'яких
most
соціальних
effective
технологій,
soft social
яка дає
technologies,
змогу
enabling the
проводити
correction
корекцію
and formation
формування
of
нового
new
важливого для самоідентичності
experiences
дорослого
that is
особистості
important for
дорослого.
the self-identity
Її
of
цілі,
the adult
мотиви і
individual, their
смисли
goals,
живих установ.
motives, and meaningful
Щодо
life
дитячої
attitudes.
книжки української, то
Now,
тут
speaking about the
виявляється,
Ukrainian
що
book for
нові
children, it
розвитки
is worth
знову
remembering
стримувані
that
асиміляційною політикою метрополії.
it was artificially
І
hindered
вона
by the
можливо
assimilation
була
policies of the
поділена на
metropolises,
підконтрольну
which
певній
constantly
паномничий
divided
доктрині,
literature into
натомість
works
офіційно
controlled by the
підтриманій
dominant
посилюваному
doctrine,
і ту,
officially
яка була
supported and
зосереджена на
widespread, and
націєтворчій
those
функції,
focus on nation
зазвичай
building
малотиражну,
function,
малодоступну або
often small
недорогу.
circulation,
І,
inaccessible, or
власне,
even
доба
banned.
незалежності – це
And the age of
перший
independence
істинний проміжок
marks the first and
державного
only
буття
period of
дитячої
coherent
книжки в
state
Україні.
existence
І
for
оцим
children's
він
books in Ukraine,
протистоїть усім
setting
іншим
it
періодам,
apart
коли вона
from all
розвивалася
other periods
безперервно і
during which they
проактивно.
developed discreetly and
Власне, ці
under
30
external
років
pressure.
дали можливість
So
єдиного
basically, this
періоду,
30
коли
years
дитяча книжка
was
в
the
Україні
only time frame where
розвивалася
children's
цілісно
literature in
в
Ukraine was
належному науковому
developing
дискурсі,
in a
належному
coherent way,
літературно-критичному
in a
дискурсі.
proper
І за
context of
своєю
literature and
сутністю цей
criticism.
процес – це був
And at its
процес
core, this
трансформації
period
наративів
was marked by
колективної травми
transformation of
від
narratives
тиску
surrounding
величезного
collective
запиту
trauma,
на
driven by the
ідентичність для
immense
дітей,
demand for
самоідентифікації
identity and
кожного молодшого
self-identification
покоління,
models
яке приходило.
for every
От,
younger generation.
зараз, сьогодні я
So,
говорю, ми будемо говорити,
now
власне, про
we focus
останній
on
період
the
російської
most recent
війни,
stage,
який в силу
the
різних
decade of the Russian-Ukrainian
соціально-економічних
war.
процесів
This
припав
era,
на
influenced by numerous
можливо
social, cultural,
піднесення
political, and
розвитку
economic
книжок для
factors,
дітей.
became a
Дуже
time of rapid
перспективний
growth and development for children's books. So basically, for you to
книгодроб
understand,
для дітей в 6 разів збільшився. Кількість
the publishing
видавців
of
виросла в
books
сотні
for children
видавців.
increased
Тобто ми починали з
sixfold.
десятка,
There are
а
100
зараз
times
300
more
видавців. І
publishers. We
все
used
це
to
за
have
ці
10, now we
останні
have
10
about
років війни.
300. And all
Тому що
that
саме
happened over
дитяча
the
книга
last
перетворилась
decade
на свого роду
because the children's
лабораторію,
book
у якій
became
прискореному
kind of a
темпі
laboratory in which we can
як
observe the
долається
accelerated
тоталітарні травми,
overcoming of
шукаються
totalitarian
відповіді
traumas
на
and the search for
комунікаційні
answers to new
виклики.
communication challenges.
На жаль, в
And
цьому дуже короткому виступі
sadly,
я не маю
in
можливості
this very close
побіжно
presentation, I do not
оглянути
have
ті
time
сотні
to
книжок,
cover
які стосуються
hundreds of
безпосередньо
books
ідентичності
that have to
і
do with
травми в
identity and
найрізноманітніших
trauma
тематичних циклах. Я вирішила зупинитися
in
тільки
various
на книзі
areas. That is
війни.
why in this
Ми
speech I
зараз
decided
з
to
вами
only
говоримо
talk about the
про те,
books on war. So
в яких
basically, currently,
варіантах і
we're
яким
talking
способом опрацьовується
about
хронотоп
which
російсько-української
means
війни
are
в
used
дитячій
to
книжці.
deal with the
Про що ще
chronotype of
треба
war in
пам'ятати,
the
про що
children's
часто
book.
забувають.
It is also important to remember one more
В
thing.
Україні
Oftentimes people
вже
forget
12
that it has been 11 years. So those children who didn't live in a peaceful country are already becoming teenagers. You see, We have a generation, and for them, all the universal experience of childhood, growing up, relationships with parents, friendship, at the same time, is experience of war. These children never experienced peace. They were born during the war, and their entire childhood happened during the war. Natalia, are you gonna show your slides? Oh, yeah, I'm gonna mention the books later, and then I'm gonna show other slides. That is why Ukrainian children's book about must not only break away from established Western European stereotypes to create a healing artistic microcosm for Ukrainian children, to not impose a vicarious trauma on them. So let's consider several trends. One of them is visual board books. So these are often art books and visual board books. Oftentimes these are fairy tales whose symbolic depths resonate with adults, while the intricate, vibrant images appeal to children. And here we can mention a tale of the Maidan, a tale of light by Christian Lukashuk, that is based on some ethnic and mythopoetic themes. Or we could also mention the conceptual books. I'm going to show you some of them. For example, a well-known book, The War That Changed Rondo, known worldwide, or an amazing book, Home. This basically is a realistic story which tells that your home is within yourself, even if your brick-and-mortar house has been destroyed. And I would like to emphasize that I'm showing you only some of the examples, just to show you a few. And aside from that, comic books are also incredibly popular because children are traumatized. And that is why another trend that is on the rise is so-called quiet books. Now, talking about comics, well, oftentimes they play the role of a biography, as for example, Super People that you can see on this slide, and it's a book that helps you overcome your trauma. So basically, it tells about how son becomes a person with disability. Why did daddy change? What turned him into a Superman? And what he can do that, and what you as a kid can do is that. And these are the stories from the life of real military people, real servicemen. And parallel, Silent Book, a very well-known book that is titled Yellow Butterfly. And here you can see the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And this is a story about a child that manages to break free from a terrible situation and manages to continue living their life. I would like to also show you the examples of some comic books, because currently it is important to also cover the topic of PTSD. For example, how do you teach a child to communicate with a dad who changed, who came back from the war? And it appeared to be that our comic books are more empowering. They are filled with joy. And basically, they demonstrate that you can overcome anything, that you will always manage to get through to the person that you love. You're not going to live in the darkness that your daddy brought back from war with him. Now, realistic prose for children. It probably is the type of the prose where war is kind of a background, because children are living amidst war and everything is happening amidst war for them. That is why these books are covering everyday problems and challenges that kids are faced with amidst the war. One of such books that mentioned it for the first time was also a very known book, an amazing book that I believe should be translated into languages that is titled My Father Became a Star. This is a book by Helena Kirchhoff, a well-known translator and writer. This is a book about a girl whose daddy went to Maidan protest and died there. Even before the child would have a sister. You know the story about how the sister was born. And at the same time, her friends' parents are in the front line. So this is a book about how a child finds the way out and understands that her daddy is always next to her, that he will not disappear as long as she lives. He is her strength. Another well-known book is titled Maya and Her Mothers. This is one of the first times when a book tells the story of the LGBT family. So this is a book about different kinds of families. And on this family, it says a family that was forced to run away from the east of Ukraine because dad was at the war and mom with daughter had to flee. Another amazing book is titled From Water into Water by Miss Lushchevska, or Miroslava and Other Kids from Our Yard by Kiprian. These are typical girly stories, fun, interesting, but nevertheless, they're the story about people who are displaced within the country, people whose siblings and parents are at war, whose children end up abroad. But at the same time, these are very nice stories about the young heroines that are reminiscent of Lindgren stories. And another example is the so-called children's diary writing. Basically, these are the description of the first weeks of Russia's attack in 2022. And the experience between the first bombings and how people had to flee their hometown. They're easily based on author's personal experience, as for example, My Forced Vacations by Katerina Yegorshkina, who was telling her personal experience, even though she made up the main heroine. And she was describing how they lived in a shelter, how the dad had to leave the family, that they had to leave their hometown, losing friends, etc. And these are books also written based on stories of other people. For example, let's take a book by Oksana Lushchevska, A Quiet Night, and it has already even been published in the US. Also, collections of stories are prominent here that tell the stories of the first days of the full-scale invasion. One good example is Children of Air Alarms, which cover stories of different children during the first few weeks of the full-scale invasion. It's like as if it was retold by the newborn Mia. And the first thing that she hears is the story of the various children amidst war. Another amazing and interesting set of books dedicated to dad at war. It's very various, but there are three topics. Dad is going to the war, waiting for the dad, communicating with the dad during the war, and the death. I'm sorry, but I have to mention that, i.e. trauma. So here are three examples by Oksana Lushchevska, an amazing book, Warm Things for Daddy. The story which centers on father preparing the girl to go skiing. And now it is the girl who is preparing things that daddy needs. This is a very small book. It has lots of pictures, but it is important to find out about what they are sharing with each other, the warmth that comes from their heart. She will be supporting her dad the same as he used to do. Natalia, I'm very sorry, but I would like to ask you to wind up. Yeah, then I will very, very quickly show you the pictures. For example, the realistic prose for teenagers. I really, really would like us to also pay some attention to that. This is extremely powerful literature. You know, sometimes I think that it is written better than what's written for the adults. What do they mostly cover? They mostly are, for example, let's look at Yuna. This is the dialogue of two young people, the Ukrainian Romeo and Juliet, that were born in Ilovarska, but they end up on two different sides, and gradually their lives diverge to the moment when the boy ends up in the Russian army.
торкаються, наприклад, клуб любителів української мови.
Or
Це діти,
let's
які
look at the Club of Belarus of Ukrainian language. These are the children who are trying to resist the occupiers, who are trying to run away from the filtration camps and flee. A book by Mr. Kusha, The Down Dark and the War of Colors, focuses on children who live in the occupied territories and how they are trying to not forget their mother tongue and find others who are still dedicated and loyal to Ukraine.
Хоча за це можна заплатити життям. Лінія
Even
Тагіна,
though you might
дуже
die
гарна,
because
складна
of
психологічна
these
історія
views.
про хлопчика, який переїжджає зі Сходу
Or
на
Line of the Terminator. This is a story
Він
about
переїжджає
a
до
young
Харкова,
man
і
who
йому
moves to
потрібно
Kiev
знайти себе
and
заново,
he
знайти себе в
is
цьому
trying
середовищі.
to re-identify
Він там
himself
був
in the
елітою,
new
а тут йому треба
context.
почати
He
спочатку.
used to be an elite
Да, все.
where he used to live.
Е,
Sorry, but you have to wind up,
показує
Natalia.
тільки. Є
Then I'm
чудові
just gonna show
великі
you the covers of the book.
оповідання,
An
є,
amazing collections
казки,
of
засновані на
stories.
реальних
There are
фактах,
fairy tales
мистецтва
that are
про
based on
улюблених
actual
всіх дітей.
facts.
В Україні
Patron,
зараз
the dogs
казки
that
про
all the kids are in
тварин,
love
які
with in
перетворилися,
Ukraine.
тобто
The fairy
це
tales
і
about
розповіді про всі
animals,
досвіди, але через
stories
тварин.
about the
Дуже
experience through
відомі
the
казки
prism
засновані на
of
образах,
an
які стали
animal's life, and
символічними. Тобто
well-known
лєвник,
fairy
лілька
tales based on the
Мрія, котик,
symbolical
білий шавка, да,
images.
ми часто
For
любимо говорити.
example,
Далі,
here we can talk
величезна купа
about
історій з елементами фантазування або
Rhea
яких
the
казок,
plane, and
зокрема, про
lots
Сама
of
Бендюга, вийшла
different
книжка «Фікус Бенджамін»
fiction.
розповідає про щастя.
For
Це
example,
історія Фікуса, хлопчика,
Benjamin the
якого,
Plant is telling
який його
the
доглядав
story
від
about
хвороб.
happiness. It is a story
Але
about
це
the
дуже
boy
весела
who
і
was
сонячна
taking care of
історія,
this
так само,
plant
як і
but
про
lost his
Медузу,
leg. But this is also
яка
a very
розповідає
good
про страшні
story.
речі, але дуже відеїстично.
Or another example
Чудові
is
антиутопії
Phantasmaya.
і фентезі.
Amazing
Зокрема,
anti-utopias
Верховний Казков,
and
який розповідає про
fiction.
події до початку
For example,
війни,
some of
і
them
тільки
cover
до
the events
початку про
prior to the
Київ,
war, and
Київ
children
як
of the
місто всіх
fiery
культур,
time
яке
tell about
протистоїть світовому
the melting pot
центр
of different
світла,
culture
який
that
ніколи
is
не
trying
згасться. Далі
to
поезія, у
the
всіх
global
різновидах,
evil.
зокрема
Next,
драматична
poetry,
поезія. Далі казкотерапія,
drama,
терапевтичні казки
also
для дорослих і для
therapeutical
дітей.
books and therapeutical fairy
Чудова
tales for both adults
біографіка
and
про
children.
людей, які зараз на
Amazing
війні, або
biographies
замовчувані
for
біографії,
that
які раніше не
or the
згадувалися. І,
biographies
звичайно,
that were
документалістика,
not covered that much, and
тобто
of course,
фіксація спогадів дітей,
documentary
фіксація
books,
переписки дітей і батьків.
the memories of the
Перепрошую,
children, their letters and
Ви зможете
correspondence.
статтю
Sorry.
подати і все це гарно
Natalia, you can
описати.
submit your
Прошу
article
завершувати.
and
Я
describe
єдине,
it
що
in a
хочу
more
сказати
elaborate way,
про
so I would like to ask you
сьогодні.
to wind up.
Дитяча
Well,
книга в
what I would
Україні.
like to
Можливо,
say
це
that
із-за
the
цього
children's book
неймовірного
in
тиску і бажання
maybe
спасти
due to
дітей,
this
не дати
pressure and the
можливості
desire to
тому
save
поколінню, на яке ми
children,
так
to
довго
preserve
працюємо, щоб
them,
вони були вільними, щоб вони
to
були
let this
сильними,
generation
щоб
be
вони були
free, to let this
українцями, щоб вони
generation
були
be
певні
strong,
себе.
to feel that they are true Ukrainians.
Наша література,
You
якщо
know,
ви її почнете перекладати,
our
вона
literature,
дасть вам
if you
так
start
багато
translating
нового
it, it
для
will
ваших
give you
дітей, що
so
ви
much
зможете
novelty for your children
Дуже
that you will
Дуже дякую,
definitely
Наталя.
appreciate it.
Звертайте, будь ласка,
Thank you.
свій
Thank you so
екран.
much, Natalia. You
Дякую.
can stop sharing your screen.
Stop
Excuse me, but could you help me with explaining how can I do that? There should be the stop sharing screen icon somewhere. Okay, oh, I did it. Sorry. Thank you so much, Natalia. Now let us move on to our next presenter. So, now I'd like to give the floor to Nadia Lubovets, the candidate of historical science, and she is the head of the Department of Biography, National Vernadsky Library of Ukraine. So, Nadia will present about memories of the Russian-Ukrainian War as a tool forming Ukrainian identity, the role of personal stories in preserving memory and constructing collective experience. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Чути мене, так? Добрий
Can
день.
you hear me?
Вітаю.
Чути, так,
Yes,
вітаємо.
yes, we can hear you.
Дякую вам
Greetings.
за можливість приєднатися до вашого шановного товариства. І дуже
Thank you
швиденько
for
я вас
inviting me
ознайомлю з
to
основними
join your
положеннями своєї
conference.
доповіді.
And now I would like to switch directly to my presentation. Memoirs are an interdisciplinary phenomenon currently at the center of a broad range of socio-humanitarian research. They are gaining increasing significance in both scientific and public discourses as a vital component of national cultural heritage and a valuable resource for information and communication. Memoirs play a key role in fostering public dialogue, transmitting historical memory, shaping identity, and uniting Ukrainian society during challenging times. Due to their memorial and communicative functions, they provide a complex and multidimensional portrayal of social and cultural relationships, not only between generations, but also among contemporaries who experience shared historical and tragic events. Given the long periods of statelessness and the numerous trials faced by the Ukrainian people during the 20th and 21st century, as reflected in memoirs, it can be argued that the majority of Ukrainian memoirs have a distinct national character, and they formed under the influence of socio-political changes, cultural needs, and national priorities, playing an essential role in the transmission of historical experience and the affirmation of Ukrainian identity. The study of Ukrainian memoirs has gained particular importance during the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war. The World War principles, moral values, and experiences accumulated in the Ukrainian memoir discourse became powerful tools for national consolidation, contribute to overcoming both collective and personal traumas, and serve to preserve historical truth while shaping a victorious strategy of behavior. In the context of hybrid warfare, where Russian propaganda actively attempts to distort and erase Ukrainian historical memory, memoirs are an, an effective tool for countering information manipulations and influences. Russian-Ukrainian war has caused immense human losses, large-scale material damage, and deep moral and physiological traumas in Ukrainian society. The academic community is now tasked with studying the anthropological dimensions of war at microhistorical level. In this regard, it is particularly relevant to study memoirs as a mechanism for understanding war as a microhistory of an individual, their life choices, worldviews, emotional reactions, internal state, everyday living conditions, and the trials they experience. After all, in crisis situations, memories are the first and quite natural reflection of a person on traumatic events. The public discourse of one's thoughts functions simultaneously as a tool for relieving tension and seeking social support. Memoir's author seeks to convey their individual, often traumatic experiences to descendants or contemporaries for various reasons. These reasons include the natural instinct for self preservation, the desire to preserve one's memory, emotions, reactions, and more. This way, the narrator highlights for society the destructive nature of war, hoping that this will, if not prevent the horrors, at least serve as a warning about their destructive consequences. In general, memoirs serve several important functions simultaneously. They act as a tool of communication, auto-communication, interpersonal, intergenerational, family, professional, method for seeking social support, mechanisms for relieving psychological tension after traumatic events, and instrument for preserving historical and national memory. When written immediately after events, memoirs are typically descriptive in nature, focusing on the events around the writer, as well as on personal experiences and reflections, fear, panic, despair, excitement, pain, helplessness, depression. A deeper reflection on events, their analysis, assessment of one's own place in them, and one's worldview revision occur much later, when acute stress gives way to a desire to structure the experience into a more coherent story. In the context of the Russian Ukrainian war, personal testimonies play a crucial role in documenting events, preserving historical truth, countering disinformation, serving as a means of national resistance, contributing to the consolidation of society, and shaping collective experience and Ukrainian identity. Today, we observe growing attention to memories and memoirs of the modern war among both academia and the public. This is evident in the active institutional collection of testimonies, the creation of archival and digital initiatives designed to document the experiences of both military personnel and civilians. This attention reflects an understanding of their significance not only in academia, but also at the state level, influencing the development of a strategy for preserving historical memory and creating mechanisms for transmitting it to future generations. For example, one result of the scientific community's efforts to build a corpus of resources on the Russian-Ukrainian war is the joint publishing project of the Institute of National Memory at the Parisian National University. And the were five publications dedicated to this topic. They contain the account of people who firsthand experienced the war, and these are the memories that date back to 2014 and onwards. They are divided to various target audiences. These memories contain the information about the accounts of those who served at the police as the volunteers, as prosecutors, as doctors, as employees of the Ministry of Emergency Situation, and also the memories of displaced persons were added to this publications. This approach enables the portrayal of history through the quintessence of the trenched truth of people who risked and are risking their own lives today to preserve Ukraine's independence. In total, since 2014 till 2022, five publications of this kind were made. But since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, this project unfortunately was closed. But the Special Archive Fund was created, and it is part of the manuscript department of the Zaporizhia branch of the Khrushchevsky Institute of Ukrainian Archaeography and Source Studies. A special book is supposed to be published, and hopefully that would become a part of the information sources as and serve as documenting the events of the Russian-Ukrainian war. We all witnessed the emergence of various memories and memoirs narratives since 2022. We believe that that is caused by the desire to shake off the shock and trauma that Ukrainians had to sustain with the full-scale invasion. And I would like to focus only on those publications and those memoirs that are available in digital format. I categorized them into five categories, and I believe that these are the this is the correct representation of the information that is available. First and foremost, we saw that the diaries and daily entries on Facebook or other social media platforms where people describe their feelings about their life during war. The second type of memories pertain to the domain of before and after. The perspective is the life that is divided by this full-scale invasion. For instance, there is the narrative that is shared by Hromadske radio team, and they are telling about the morning of the 24th of February. They published published their
спогади про Другу
insights.
світову війну.
The third group
Йдеться
of
про те, що
memories are the retrospective memories of the Second World War.
українці похилого віку, які переживали ще
Ukrainians
страхіття Другої
who
світової
had
війни,
to go
які
through
занурились, скажімо
the
так, в цю
atrocities of
війну,
the
це
Second World
викликало у
War,
них якби рефлексію, і
when
вони
faced
згадують
this
про свої
current
пережиття
war,
свого
had
трагічного
to
досвіду в період
relive
Другої
those
світової війни.
events. They are
Ілюстрацією
recalling
для цього
what
є
happened to
серія
them
публікацій
during
на
World
сторінках
War II.
газети
And
Guardian.
The Guardian published
Четверта група – це
interviews
група
with
спогади
those
людей з
who
тимчасово
wanted to
окупованих
share their
територій
accounts.
про
The
травматичні
fourth group of
події. Це дуже
memories
специфічна група спогадів,
is the memories from
які
people in
носять
temporarily
закритий
occupied
характер і які проводяться
territories.
спеціальними,
They
скажімо так,
tell about the traumatic
міжнародними
events and
організаціями під егідою
these
Міжнародного кримінального
stories, these
трибуналу, які
memories are
збирають
collected by domestic
конкретні,
and
скажімо так,
international
спогади про
organizations
ті
that want to document
масові
crimes
убивства, які
that
вчинилися на
took
окупованих
place
територіях
in
і
the
які згодом
occupied
стануть джерельною
territories.
базою для
And hopefully in the future, these
вивчення
stories
суспільно-політичних
would
наслідків війни і для
become evidence
кримінального
in
міжнародного
the
кримінального трибуналу.
cases
П'ята група
at the
спогадів – це дитячі
International
спогади, про
Criminal
які так
Tribunal.
дуже
The fifth
гарно
group
розказувала
of
Наталя
memories
Петрівна,
are
тому на
childhood
цій групі я не
memories.
буду зупинятися.
These
І
memories
шоста
were well
група
described
спогадів – це
by my
літературні
colleague earlier.
спогади,
And there is
спогади в
the sixth
жанрі
group that I would like to
нон-фікшн,
add. This one
які
is the group of literary
ілюстрацією до цієї
memoirs
групи
in the
спогадів можна
nonfiction genre.
сказати, що є
From this perspective,
електронні такі тематичні підбірки, які
there
вміщені
are
на
no,
електронному ресурсі
there are some
«Професійна
electronic
культура» під
resources
назвою
that are
«Нотатки від
available.
спогадів».
For
Самому
instance,
підсумовуючи свою доповідь, я так
социальная
розумію, що часу вже
культура
мало, можу
or a
сказати, що ми
series of
перебуваємо
military
лише на
essays
початковому
that are
етапі
called the
наукового
notes of the
вивчення
military.
спогадових
They
наративів
contain
як
direct reflections
джерельної
from the
бази для
combatants.
майбутніх досліджень і
And
не
we
лише
see that
історичних, а
these
для великого
memories give us
корпусу
the
соціогуманітарних
opportunity
досліджень. Основне
to
наше завдання – це зберегти
to
всі ті спогади динамік
explore this
інтерактивні, які
topic. I believe
розпорошені
that
по
our
соціальних
main
мережах,
task
на
is
цифрових
to
ресурсах,
preserve all
інформаційних
these
ресурсах. І
memories,
єдиний вихід, який я
even
бачу,
though they
це
are
створити
scattered on
єдиний
various
ресурс
social media.
під
I
умовною
believe that the
назвою
only way out
«Російсько-українська
is
війна в
to
спогадах»,
create a
куди б
special
стикалися всі
platform that would
спогади,
be
які
titled Ukrainian War
існують
in
в нашому
Memories,
інформаційному просторі. Дякую за
where
увагу.
we would
Вибачте,
collect
якщо я
all the
перебрала час.
information available
Пані
on this
Надії, ми вам
topic.
дуже
Thank you
дякуємо за
very
цікаву
much,
доповідь. Ви не
and I'm
перебрали, ви
sorry
навіть
for taking
зекономили
too
нам
much of your time.
Хвилини.
часу
Thank
та 2
you,
хвилини.
Nadia,
І
very
цим
much.
самим
Well,
ви
actually, you
даєте
saved us 2
нагоду
minutes.
нашій дискутанці, пані Мадяні
And
Шаповал,
I would like to give the
філологічних
floor
наук,
to Mariana
яка
Shapoval,
працює в
our
Київському національному університеті імені
discussant,
Тараса
and
Шевченка,
she works at
висловити свої коментарі,
Taras
зауваження,
Shevchenko Kyiv
запитання
National
до вас. Я
University.
дуже
She
прошу
might have
всіх
some questions to you, and
доповідачів
I will give
стисло
her the floor
відповідати на
now.
запитання
I would
або
like to
коментарі
ask
пані
all
Мар'яни,
our
бо після
panelists
її коментарів
to
і ваших
be
відповідей ми
concise while
сподіваємося ще
responding to
на
questions.
можливість
As
аудиторії
after
поставити
your
запитання, а
answers,
вас
we hope that
відповісти. Прошу
we
бути
will be
стислими.
able to
Дякую.
take
Прошу, пані
more
Мар'яно.
questions from the audience
Щиро дякую,
and
пані
for you
Надію,
to
за
answer those
представлення.
questions. Thank
Дякую
you very much for
організаторам
giving me the
конференції
floor,
за
and thank
можливість
you
бути
for
новій для
introductory
мене ролі
remarks, Nadia.
дискутанта. У нас
And I would
не
like
дуже
to
прийнято
thank
в Україні
Indiana
така позиція
University
на
for
конференціях.
giving me this
І
new
приємно,
role.
що це дискутант у
It is
надзвичайно
quite
актуальній панелі
unfamiliar to me.
«Ідентичність, пам'ять і
I,
трансформація в
this is
українському
the first
літературному
time I
дискурсі».
would like
Це
to act as
надзвичайно
a
актуальна
discussant.
тематика.
And I would like to say
І
that the topics that we are discussing today are highly relevant.
це надзвичайно є актуальна тематика, і я запрошувала своїх студентів долучитися до
I actually
конференції. Добре, як
invited
буде
my
запис.
students to
І,
join the
але
conference,
концепт
and I hope that they will be
концепт,
able to watch
вибачте,
the recordings afterwards.
пам'яті, нам треба пам'ятати про те,
The
що час
concept
дуже
of
швидко
memory, well,
збігає,
yes, we
тому я
need to
просто
bear
скажу,
in
що
mind the
всі
fact that
учасники цієї
the
панелі,
time is
відомі
running fast.
науковці в
I
Україні,
would
вони
like just
мають
to mention that
монографії,
all the panelists on
або
this
готують
panel are
монографії.
renowned scholars
Зараз
in
я їм дуже
Ukraine.
була
They
вдячна
had
за те, що
authored
вони мені вчасно
monographs
прислали свої
and
доповіді, дали
they
можливість
working on some
вивчити.
monographs. I would
Трошки
like
не
to
встигли
thank you
вони
for
це, що тут
sending
що було у
me
їх
their
записках,
presentations
озвучити
in
на цій
advance.
панелі.
Unfortunately, they
Тому
were not
прошу
able to
про мене
cover
про це
everything
перепрошую
that
за
they
те,
had on
що я,
their
можливо,
notes.
поставлю запитання до
And
фактів,
I would
які
like to
не
apologize
прозвучали тут,
if
але
I
були у
ask
ваших
something
доповідях.
about what
Передусім,
was not
звертаюся до
mentioned.
пані Галини Олександрової,
And
що ми чекаємо
yet,
вже
I
вашої
still have
монографії
some
про
questions. Halina,
Стороженка,
we are
про
waiting
Миколу Стороженка, чи
for
він буде
your
Ілліч, ще Володимир, ще
paper
не
on
зрозуміло.
Storozhenko to be
Але
published. We do not know
щодо
which
Володимира, то я
Storozhenko you
хотіла
will
запитати
write about,
таке.
but
От він,
I
працюючи в
have the
Москві,
following
зберіг
question.
свою
Mykola
національну
Volodymyrych
ідентичність.
Storozhenko, he was
І,
working in
як ви
Moscow, and yet he
сказали,
preserved his
маркером
national
тієї
identity.
ідентичності був
And
інтерес
as
до
you mentioned,
Шевченка, до його
the
життя, до
a
його
sign of
оточення, Щепкін,
his
Варвара
national identity
Репріна,
preservation was his
дослідження
interest
творчості Шевченка.
in
Часто ці
Shevchenko,
дослідження були
his
як
connections with
пожертв,
Varvara
вони
Repnina,
були на
and donations
волонтерських
that
певною мірою
made.
засадах. А скажіть, будь ласка, пані Галина, які
Therefore,
ще
I
теми
was wondering
дослідників
about
українського
different
походження були
topics,
для них
different
знаковими, знакові для
scholars,
їх
other
національного
scholars, Ukrainian scholars
самоусвідомлення?
who
А
were
також
also in
третій персонаж,
the
крім
view of their
Миколи
national
Ілліча і Миколи
identity awareness.
Володимировича, це журнал
And
Київська
I
старина.
also
Це ніби
wanted to ask
такий
a
був у
question
вас третій
about
персонаж у
Kievska
вашій
Starina
доповіді.
journal.
І
It seemed
так
to
ми всі
me that
переживали,
it was
що
a
про
third
долю цього
character in your
часопису. І
presentation alongside
Микола Ілліч
to
теж
Mykola
у
Storozhenko. Mykola
1889
Ilyich
році хвилювався, всіляко
actually
хотів
was
підтримати.
worried
І ця
about his
драматургічна
publications
така
in
інтрига, чому ж, на
Kievska
вашу думку, він
Starina
не
in
повернувся в Україну,
1889.
хоч точно мав
And
таке
I was
бажання?
wondering about your
Чи зараз
opinion,
відповідати, чи
why
потім
he
усі відповіді
didn't
будуть, пані
Можливо,
come
Надії?
можливо,
back to
всі разом. Давайте ви
Ukraine.
поставте
Разом,
запитання
добре.
стисло і
Should I ask
стислі
all the
Тоді
відповіді.
questions
я
right away,
переходжу
or should
стисло
I
до
wait for the answers?
запитання
Well,
до
no, just
пані
ask all the
Оксани.
questions right away. All right, then
Надзвичайно
my next
цікава
question
ваша
is
робота, але
addressed
тут
to
не
Oksana.
прозвучала
I am
ваша
very much
доповідь,
interested in
перепрошую,
your
і ті
work, but
роботи, які я
unfortunately, I
подивилася, щоб
didn't
краще
hear
розібратися в тому, що ви
from you,
сказали в
nor
доповіді.
I found
І
this
мені
information
надзвичайно
in
було
your
цікаво ваш концепт про культурну
presentation,
рану. Ви
written
пишете,
notes.
що саме літературна війна
You
на Донбасі
mentioned that
сформувала в
the
українському
war
суспільстві
on
особливу
Donbass
культуру, яку ми
shaped
можемо
particular
дефінувати як
culture
культурну
that
рану.
could be
Чи
defined
можете
as a
ви
cultural
детальніше
wound.
зупинитися, які складники цього концепту?
Could
Що
you
ця
elaborate on the
культура
concept
рани
of
транслює, і чому вона
the
формується саме
cult,
війною, а
the
не іншими
culture of
колективними
wound,
травмами
and
українців?
why
Також
this wound
надзвичайно в
is
вашій доповіді
exacerbated by the
мені
war and
було
not by the
цікаво
other
те, що
collective
ви
traumas that we have in Ukraine.
торкаєтеся
Yet
того,
another
що
aspect you
у
touched upon
ситуації
in your
інформаційних
presentation
надможливостей ми цю
is
війну, ті, хто в
the
тилу, і ті, хто не в Україні,
capacities
переживаємо
of
певною мірою
those
як
who
реаліті-шоу, і
live in
все може
Ukraine but
бути
far
до
from the front line, as we experience this
останнього
war
пороху
differently depending
зафільмоване
on where
і
we are,
трансльоване
be it the
різними
front
каналами
line or away from the front line in
зв'язку. Це насправді
safer
трошки
locations.
уже травматично.
And we know
Як ці
that
практики
communication is mostly
позначаються на
taking place
травмованих, і
via
чи корисні вони
the
для них, і чи не
communication over the
призводять до
phone. And what
ретравматизації, чи
happens
вони
in
не
this type of
поглиблюють рану?
relations
І
on
до наступної,
they
до доповідачки
exacerbated by
пані
this form
Надії
of
Любовець теж
communication?
схоже
Is
запитання.
it causing
Пані
deeper
Надія говорила про
traumatization?
загальні
Now
речі, про підходи
I
до
have a question to
мемуарів,
Nadia Lubovitz.
але я би
Nadia
хотіла
Lubovitz mentioned the
уточнити,
approaches that are used to
чи є якісь
memoirs,
цифрові
and yet I
платформи,
would like
що
to
збирають
clarify,
свідчення,
are there
архіви,
any
бази
digital
даних,
platforms that
мультимедійні
contain
проекти?
archives,
Чи, можливо, державні
databases, or
інституції або
multimedia
громадські
projects?
ініціативи їх
Are there any
запроваджують.
civil
Чому
society
мене це цікавить?
organizations or civic
Мене
initiatives that are
цікавить, у
introduced in
якому
this type
статусі
of
ці
platforms?
збирачі,
The reason I'm
як
asking
вони
this question
контролюють
is
або
because I
популяризують подальше
am
використання
concerned
цих
about
матеріалів.
the
Усе ж таки це
collections that
чиїсь
are
особисті
made.
наративи, це
And
чутливі теми.
I was
Я
wondering
запитую
about
зараз навіть не
their state
про
and access to these
авторські права, а про той
memories,
етичний
since
бік, як
they
певною
are
мірою це
sensitive. They
зафіксоване
pertain
вже
to sensitive
реаліті-шоу.
information.
Одним словом, хто контролює
And
ці
I was
наративи?
wondering about
І на
the
сам кінець у мене
authors and the
є
copyright. Who
запитання до пані
is
Надії,
keeping
пані Наталі
this information
Марченко.
in check?
Пані
And now I
Наталю,
would
ми
like
добре
to ask
знаємо вас як дослідницю
Natalia
дитячої
Marchenko the
літератури,
following.
авторку монографій
Natalia,
про
we
нашого
know
класика
you
Дедліту
as a
Володимира
scholar who is
Рудьківського.
carrying out
Але
researches
тепер
in
там
children's
проскочило у вашій
literature. You
презентації,
are
що
well known
нещодавно вийшла
for
ваша
your
книжка,
researches on Volodymyr
художня
Rudkivsky,
книжка для
and
дітей
we
«Тато мій
heard
Петлюра». Так,
you
це книжка
authored
для дітей.
a book
І таке
for
запитання,
children.
з
It
якого
is
боку
called My
вам
Father Petlura.
приємніше бути?
And I
Авторкою
have the
чи
following question to
дослідницею?
you.
Де вас
Which
чекає
side do
більше
you enjoy
вдячних
more, being
читачів?
a scholar or
Дякую
being
за
an
можливість
author?
поставити
And what about the
запитання.
audience? Which
Я
audience
дуже
you
дякую
enjoy
пані
more?
Мар'яні за такий
Thank you very
глибокі,
much,
детальні
Mariana, for
коментарі,
such
запитання.
in-depth
Я з
comments
прикрістю
and
хочу сказати,
questions.
що в нас, на жаль, немає часу,
Unfortunately,
щоб
I would
глибоко
like
детально. Я
to
дуже прошу
remind you
доповідачів
that we
стисло
are pressed
через
for
те, що о
time. Therefore,
16:30
please
має
be
розпочатись наступна
concise,
секція.
as
Прошу,
in
починаємо пані
11
з Галини
minutes we will start the
Олександрової.
next panel. We will start with Galina Alexandrova.
Мікрофон увімкніть, будь ласка. Пані
Please
Галино,
unmute yourself.
говорите.
Halina, we cannot hear you because you are on mute. Thank you so much, Ms. Shapoval, for your question. So, her question was why Mykola Storozhenko, professor at Moscow University, did not come back to Ukraine to work and live. He started as the scholar of Ukrainian literature. The first of his papers basically was a monograph or a review, a feedback on a book written by another Ukrainian who also worked within the sphere of the imperial literature, Danilo Mordovtsev. He had a collection of Little Russia's works, and Storozhenko, back when he was a student, he analyzed this collection. Next, he wrote an article about Pantelimon Kulish, and Osnova magazine lost that article and ceased to exist at a later stage, as we all are well aware. Next, Storozhenko, having graduated from the university, well, he did not keep in touch with his father. He didn't have much financial support coming from his father, even though his father had money, lived in Poltava Oblast, so he had to work in parallel. And when the 300th birthday anniversary of Shakespeare was celebrated, Storozhenko gave 5 lectures. Those were open lectures. Anyone could come, purchase tickets to listen to those lectures. And this was covered by an imperial newspaper. His father, a nobleman, read this publication, and his heart was touched so much that he started giving money to his son. So what did Storozhenko do? He went to London, to Paris. He started working on his master paper and on his thesis dedicated to Shakespeare. So in my opinion, maybe he wanted to stay away from the great literature and work more with the global one. Also, I was talking about Osip Bodansky's influence. Alina, I'm very sorry. I would like to ask you to be concise. And you can find the documents in the Central Historical Archive, which has an order to prohibit Mykola Ilyich Storozhenko back in 1867 when he was studying Shakespeare in London, to ban him from coming back to Kiev and seek a job there. This was first published by Vasil Ulyanovsky. There is a book by Mykola Storozhenko dedicated to his biography, his memoirs, and it was published in 2004. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, Oksana Pokonska, the floor is yours. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Why culture of a wound? Why did I even come up with this metaphor? Given the issues that the literature, the text of war is dealing with. If we're talking about the classical culture of trauma, it's something that is not always visible. I mean, it's invisible, right? But at the same time, culture of wound, it is both the internal state of the society or a person, and also what is happening on the outside. And the literature is absorbing, is embedding, is reflecting all that. And at the same time, the culture of the wound is a special language that basically the authors are seeking and looking for, starting 2014. Yes, before 2022, it was expressed in a different way, using other avenues. And after 2022, the authors started looking for other tools to convey the shock, the influence, and the impact that the Ukrainian society and Ukrainian culture have to deal with. And also, you were asking about why we're not talking about the historical aspects, but about this war specifically. I have touched upon it in my presentation. This war is also absorbing this historical traumatic experience. It is unavoidable if we're talking about the current war, because it is a cause and it is the effect of this war. It impacts our way of thinking based on the experience that we go through. Also, the family generational trauma, how we are looking for our own self by learning about this family and generational stories. And you know how this experience unites, bring together this memory discourses. And for me, this basically something that represents both what is on the inside and both what is on the outside. And in my opinion, this metaphor, culture of the wound, represents it really well. Well, we'll see. We'll see how well it will prove to be in the future in this metaphor. And now to your second question about the reality show. If I am not mistaken, whether their literature is not contributing to the vicarious trauma, right? In general, it seems to me that on the one hand, yes, it is hard to live through all of this experience. Clearly, it deepens our trauma, especially for people who are staying outside the front line. Or say if someone has a family member who is in the front line, this is still not a direct experience for us. But when we access this visualization, it deepens the trauma. But on the other hand, it also allows us to understand how we can work with it in therapy. Because when we're reading literature, when we can visualize the plots that can be found in these books. For example, let's take Valeria Ananiev's Traces on the Road. Oksana, I'm very sorry that I'm interrupting you. Yeah, I'm almost done. I think that this is also a very good therapy. Yes, it deepens the trauma, but at the same time, it makes trauma hurt. It makes it visible. It allows you to deal with that, maybe not fully, but at least to a certain extent. Thank you. Now, Nadia, because her presentation seconds what the previous speaker mentioned. Yes, we're talking about collection and preservation. Well, basically, there are three groups, state, civil society, and individuals. Basically, the state, when working with the Institute of National Memory, when they are collecting the stories, they develop methodological recommendations, and there is a consent that parties have to sign. Everything is controlled. There is monitoring and oversight, and they are gathering, but they are not making it public security reasons. I'm talking about NGOs and civil initiatives. I think that their approach is similar. Because making it public on the websites of different NGOs is only done with the consent of the respondent. I'm talking about individual reflections on social media. Basically, the person is sharing their personal memories on social media, having registered on that social media, having consented to their data being used, they basically already agree and they're sharing it with their friends or they share it publicly. So this is how it works. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to Natalia, but please be brief. Well, it is probably the easiest for me to respond because I have been focusing on books for children starting the 9th grade of school. And I have started publishing my books a long time ago, over a decade ago. It is amazing that my book was also highlighted during London Book Fair, but it basically combines two experiences because this is not copying the biographies that already exist for their children. Based on the best European experience and what works for Ukraine, I created a biography model of working with the so-called complex biographies that also result in the social resistance, Mazepa, Petlura, and Bandera that became the tags that people used to call Ukrainians. And how can we share it so that it would not traumatize children and so that it would not trigger adults at the same time? So that it predates the space of your people. And it's amazing that it works. I hope that it will continue performing just as well in the future. Thank you so much, Natalia. I'd like to thank all of our presenters and our discussants. We have 1 minute left. We have only 1 minute left. Yes, Oksana Smrzewska, the floor is yours. Good afternoon or good evening. Ladies, thank you once again. I would like to add something else when it comes to oversight of the oral historical research because I also am dealing with this subject matter. And there is such a notion of self-censorship. So even if I have the consent of my respondents to publish something from the occupied territories, understanding potential threats, I am not making it public since the war is still ongoing. So there is also the notion of self-censorship that we should bear in mind. Thank you so much, Oksana. Well done. Thank you. Thank you all. This is the end of our first session, and now I'm ready to give the floor to other speakers. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our amazing presenters.